This week, China will release some key economic data for May, including inflation figures. Joining me now on the phone to talk about the current state of the Chinese economy is Mark Williams, a senior China economist at Capital Economics. Mark, not so long ago, most investors seemed worried that China was possibly overheating. Now we're hearing concern about a hard landing. What is really happening, and is inflation still a concern?
Well, market sentiment about China certainly seems to swing between extremes. I think inflation is obviously still a concern in China at the moment. It's at a level which is relatively high for China, but we need to put this into some perspective. It's still pretty low for an emerging market economy. Inflation in China is the lowest of any of the BRIC economies, and it's also stopped rising. It's been hovering at around 5.5% for several months now. So I think there's reasons to be optimistic that the inflation problem is at least not getting worse and could start to get better soon. On the other side of the coin, there's a lot of evidence that economic growth has been slowing since the turn of the year. But still, we're talking about 8 or 9% GDP growth, which is not too bad. And of course, if inflation does slow, as we expect in the second half of the year, then that will leave the authorities some room to loosen policy to stabilise the economy.
The government set an annual inflation target of 4% this year, but as we know, prices are continuing to escalate. Surely this figure seems quite optimistic.
It's going to be very hard to meet that 4% annual target. We should bear in mind that is an average for the year that the government targets, rather than for any given month. But even so, given where we are at the moment, it's going to be very hard to bring that average down. However, I'm not sure the government will worry too much about that. They've missed their inflation targets in the past, and inflation at the moment is, as long as it doesn't increase too much further, I think the policymakers will be fairly happy, and certainly will, if inflation starts to come down, will be turning their attention to the risks to growth rather than the risk from inflation over the next few months.
It's been nearly a year since the yuan's peg to the dollar was actually dropped. So what is likely to happen over the next coming year or so?
Well, I think we are likely to see more of the same, which is fairly slow appreciation against the dollar. We're forecasting moves of roughly 5% at an annualized rate. I think the market expectations for something closer to 2%. Now, that may sound a fair amount if it continues for 2 or 3 years in a row, but we have to remember that over the last year, this appreciation against the dollar has taken place against the backdrop of a weakening dollar. So actually, the renminbi is weaker today in trade-weighted terms relative to the euro and yen and so on than it was a year ago. So currency appreciation is not hampering China's export sector too much in the moment. If anything, currency policy is another stimulus to growth.
Another concern for China is rapid wage increases. How could this affect their competitiveness in relation to other emerging markets?
Well, wages are increasing on average 15% or so year on year, and we hear many companies where wages are increasing by considerably more than that. But we have to remember this isn't new. Wage increases have been at that sort of rate for most of the last 5 or 6 years, and yet, of course, Chinese firms remain very competitive. One reason for that is that Chinese firms are increasing their productivity very rapidly. Another reason is that, of course, wages are rising pretty fast elsewhere. It's not just China that has wage increases. And when you look at, for example, the cost of imports into the US from China and compare it with the cost of imports from other emerging markets, you find that imports from China are not going up in price as fast as those from elsewhere in the world. So if anything, actually, Chinese firms are becoming more competitive, not less.
Thank you, Mark. Every day we'll be interviewing economists and financial experts on Dukascopy TV, so stay tuned. Goodbye.